Hello! I would be very pleased if you would like the video. Subscribe so you don't miss new videos every day that will help you relax. I'm also curious where you are listening to me from and what time it is now. Write it in the comments. Enjoy watching! The first light of dawn spilled over the endless prairie, painting the horizon in muted gold and rose. The chill of the night still clung to the air as the campfire's embers glowed faintly, crackling beneath a pot of weak coffee. Jake Malone stirred, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, his breath forming small clouds in the cool morning. Another day was beginning on the frontier. The year was 1874, and the cattle trails stretched across the heart of the American West, from Texas to Kansas. Jake was one of thousands of cowboys driving herds north toward the railheads, where trains would carry the beef to the growing cities of the East. It was hard work, sunup to sundown, under the watchful sky that gave nothing for free. He pulled on his boots, stiff from yesterday's dust, and adjusted the worn leather hat that had shaded him through countless miles. The prairie around him was quiet except for the distant bawl of cattle and the soft whinny of his horse, Scout, tethered nearby. The animal shook its mane, impatient for the long ride ahead. Coffee was more of a ritual than a pleasure, bitter and gritty, but it burned away the sleep. Jake sat beside the fire with a tin cup in hand, watching as the other cowboys roused one by one. There was Hank, the trail boss, already issuing orders, and young Billy, barely 17, still rubbing his eyes like a boy. By the time the sun had cleared the horizon, the herd was restless. The men moved quickly, coiling ropes, checking saddles, cinching girths. Each knew his role by heart. In the West, mistakes weren't just costly, they could be deadly. A spooked herd could stampede, crushing anything in its path. Jake mounted Scout with a practiced motion, feeling the familiar creak of the saddle and the strength beneath him. He clicked his tongue, and the horse responded instantly. The day's work was beginning, and every man was a small part of the great machine that was the cattle drive, an unending river of hooves, dust, and sweat. As they set out, the sound of thousands of hooves filled the plain, a deep rhythmic thunder that rolled across the land. The sun climbed higher, turning the cool dawn into the promise of another sweltering day. Dust rose in clouds around the riders, coating their clothes and skin until everything seemed the same dull brown. For hours, Jake rode flank position, to the side of the herd, keeping the cattle moving straight and calm. He watched for strays, whistling softly to guide them back. The land stretched endlessly, dotted with sagebrush and the occasional lonely mesquite tree. The only landmarks were distant hills shimmering in the heat. Every cowboy carried his own scars and stories. Jake thought often of his father, who had driven cattle long before him, back when the West was wilder still. He had died with his boots on, somewhere along the Red River, defending his herd from rustlers. Out here, such endings weren't rare, they were expected. The morning passed in the rhythm of the trail, the steady pace, the constant watch, the shared silence. Cowboys didn't talk much during the drive. They saved their words for the campfire. Still, there was a quiet bond among them, forged by dust, danger, and the long miles that wore away everything false. At midday, the herd slowed, and the men stopped near a small creek to water the horses. The air shimmered with heat, and the prairie hummed with insects. Jake splashed cool water on his face, feeling the sting of sun and sweat. He knelt by the creek, his reflection distorted by the ripples, a face weathered far beyond his years. Lunch was simple: beans, jerky, and black coffee. The chuck wagon, driven by old Gus, carried what little comfort the trail allowed. Gus joked that a good cook could make anything taste better than dust, but out here, even dust had its flavor. The men laughed anyway. Humor was their armor against monotony and pain. After a short rest, the drive resumed. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of approaching rain. In the west, weather changed faster than a gambler's luck, and Jake could already see the dark clouds forming on the far edge of the horizon. A storm was brewing, and storms on the open prairie were no small matter. By late afternoon, the sky darkened, and thunder began to roll. The cattle grew uneasy, their heads lifting, tails flicking nervously. Hank shouted orders, voices barely audible over the wind. Jake spurred Scout forward, moving to the edge of the herd. They needed to keep the cattle calm, or the entire drive could be lost. The first drops fell, large, cold, and heavy. Lightning streaked across the horizon, illuminating the sea of horns and movement. Jake felt his heart pound as he shouted to the others, his voice lost in the roar. The herd began to push forward, fear taking hold. The stampede had begun. The ground trembled beneath him as thousands of pounds of muscle and fear surged into motion. Jake clung to the saddle, guiding Scout alongside the leaders, trying to turn them in a wide arc, the only way to stop the deadly rush. The rain stung his face, and the world became a blur of mud, thunder, and chaos. Minutes stretched into eternity. One wrong move could mean death. The herd's momentum slowly curved, the wave of motion turning back on itself, forming a tightening spiral. Jake shouted, urging the others to follow suit. Bit by bit, the stampede lost its fury, the thundering hooves slowing to a heavy, exhausted trot. When it was finally over, the prairie lay scarred with churned mud and scattered cattle. The rain eased into a steady drizzle, washing away the dust and blood. Jake sat motionless for a moment, breathing hard, soaked to the bone. Around him, the men checked the herd, a few losses, but nothing catastrophic. They had been lucky. As night approached, the storm passed eastward, leaving the land fresh and quiet once more. The cowboys gathered near the fire, drying their clothes and nursing sore muscles. Gus handed out tin plates of stew, and the smell alone felt like salvation. Jake took a slow bite, staring into the flickering flames. Another day on the trail was done. Tomorrow would bring the same dust, sweat, danger, and endless miles. Yet in that hard life, there was freedom, a kind that few men ever knew. Under the vast sky, with only his horse and the land for company, Jake Malone felt both small and infinite. The dawn after the storm came quiet and pale, with mist rising low across the prairie. The herd stood restless, still shaken from the night's chaos. Jake awoke stiff and sore, his clothes damp from rain and his muscles aching from the long fight to control the stampede. Yet there was no time for rest. On the trail, the drive never waited for comfort. He saddled Scout in silence, tightening the leather straps with practiced hands. The air smelled clean, washed by the storm, and the sky stretched wide and empty. The chuck wagon creaked into motion as Gus hummed a low tune, a sound as old as the plains themselves. The men rode out again, guiding the herd north toward Dodge City, the heart of the cattle trade. By 1870, Dodge had become a legend, a crossroads of money, whiskey, and trouble. Every cowboy knew that when the drive ended there, the pay came fast, and so did the temptation. Saloon doors would swing open, and men who'd spent months in the saddle would gamble away their wages before dawn. But for now, that dream was still far away. The herd moved slowly, spread across miles of open land. Dust rose in lazy swirls beneath the hooves, coating the air like fog. Jake kept his eyes on the horizon, where the land folded into gentle hills. Each man had his post, point, swing, flank, and drag, positions learned by repetition and necessity. The trail boss rode at the front, silent but watchful. Around midday, they crossed a stretch of dry riverbed, cracked and white beneath the sun. The summer heat returned with vengeance, shimmering off the ground like glass. The cattle bellowed, tongues hanging, and the men's canteens grew lighter with each hour. Water was the one thing they could never have enough of. Jake remembered the old drives his father spoke of, before the railroads carved the land, when trails ran for months through Comanche country. Back then, every crossing meant risk. The tribes guarded their lands fiercely, and many drives ended in blood. Now, treaties and forts kept the frontier quieter, but danger never disappeared entirely. A shout broke through the heat. Billy, the youngest of the crew, had spotted a few steers breaking off from the herd. Jake spurred Scout forward, dust flying from the horse's hooves. Together, they cut across the plain, circling wide to push the strays back in line. It was hard, hot work, but success meant pride, and Billy's grin when they returned said enough. By late afternoon, they reached a watering hole, a rare gift on the trail. The cattle crowded the edge, snorting and stamping as they drank. The men filled their canteens and splashed water on sunburned faces. Jake leaned against a fence post, watching dragonflies skim across the surface. The peace was fragile, but it was peace all the same. Gus served supper early, beans and bacon cooked over a fire that smoked more than it burned. The men ate in silence, save for the soft crackle of flames and the faint lowing of cattle settling for the night. The sky blazed orange, then faded into purple and blue. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, its cry echoing through the dusk. After eating, Jake took the first night watch. He rode slow circles around the sleeping herd, humming quietly to keep them calm. The old Chisholm Trail, he sang under his breath, the old song every cowboy knew. The rhythm of his voice blended with the night wind, carrying across the open plain like a ghostly lullaby. The stars came out sharp and cold, each one clear as glass. Jake looked up and wondered if his father had watched the same sky years before, out on some other trail. Out here, under all that space, a man could feel the smallness of his own life. And somehow, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like belonging. At midnight, the second watch took over. Jake handed off his post to Hank, nodding in silence. He stretched out on his bedroll near the fire, pulling his hat low over his eyes. The faint sound of hooves, the steady breathing of horses, and the whisper of wind across the grass lulled him into a dreamless sleep. Morning broke with a haze of red light. The trail dust from the day before hung in the air, turning everything a muted gold. The men rose one by one, weary but steady. There were no lazy mornings in a cattle drive. Every day began before the sun and ended only when the work was done. The day's path led them through open country, dotted with herds of wild mustangs and distant silhouettes of buffalo. Though the great bison herds had dwindled, remnants still roamed, massive and unbothered. Jake admired their strength, untamed, ancient creatures that had survived long before men and fences. By noon, the wind carried a new sound, the distant rumble of thunder. Another storm was rolling in, this one darker than the last. Hank signaled the crew to tighten formation, keeping the herd compact. Storms on the plains could turn deadly fast. Lightning could start grass fires that spread for miles. Every man's nerves tensed in silence. The sky blackened, and the air grew electric. Rain began to fall in heavy sheets, turning the ground to mud. The herd moved slower now, hooves sinking deep. Jake rode beside Billy, shouting over the roar of the storm. They had to keep the cattle from panicking again. One stampede was enough for a lifetime. Hours later, the rain eased, leaving the world soaked and shining. Steam rose from the cattle, and water dripped from the brims of hats. The prairie smelled rich, alive. The storm had passed without disaster, though every man looked 10 years older. They found high ground to camp for the night, their spirits heavy but unbroken. That evening, as the fire flickered weakly in the damp air, the men shared stories, rare moments of laughter breaking through fatigue. Hank told of a time he rode with Goodnight himself, one of the great trailblazers. Jake listened, imagining the early days of the drive, when every mile was uncharted and every creek crossing a gamble. Before turning in, Jake took a long look at the horizon. Tomorrow, they'd be another day closer to Dodge, another step toward the end of the trail. He could almost see it, the lights, the noise, the whiskey, the faces of strangers. Yet part of him wondered if he truly belonged anywhere but out here, between sky and dust. After weeks on the trail, the land began to change. The open prairie gave way to rolling hills dotted with cottonwoods, and in the distance, faint plumes of smoke rose from the chimneys of Dodge City. The men felt it before they saw it, that restless anticipation that came when the long ride neared its end. Pay, whiskey, and a bed waited just beyond the horizon. Dodge was no ordinary town. By 1874, it was the wild heart of the West, a mix of law and chaos, cattle and gunfire. The sound of boots on wooden sidewalks, saloon pianos clanging through the night, and the endless chatter of gamblers and cowhands filled its narrow streets. To a cowboy fresh off the trail, it was heaven and hell in equal measure. Hank led the crew toward the stockyards, where the air hung heavy with dust and manure. Buyers waited by the pens, sharp-eyed men in clean coats who had never spent a night under open sky. The herd was driven in, counted, and inspected. Deals were made in minutes. For months of hardship, the payoff came down to a few numbers and a handshake. Jake watched in silence as the buyers weighed the cattle. Money would be divided later, once the sale cleared, but the sight of silver coins in Hank's hands was enough to lift the men's spirits. They had survived the trail, the storms, the hunger, the endless miles. Now, for a few short days, they would live like kings. By sundown, The herd was gone, and the men rode into town. The main street of Dodge was alive. Wagons clattering, music spilling from saloons, women in bright dresses calling from balconies. The smell of whiskey and gun oil filled the air. A brass band played near the Long Branch Saloon, and every door swung with noise and laughter. The cowboys tied up their horses and stepped into the chaos. Inside the saloon, light and sound collided, clinking glasses, piano tunes, laughter that could turn to gunfire in a blink. Jake felt dizzy from it all. After weeks of silence and dust, the noise was almost too much. He ordered a drink, the burn of whiskey reminding him that he was still alive. Across the room, Billy was already at a poker table, grinning like a fool. Gus was talking to the bartender, trading trail stories for free refills. Even Hank allowed himself a rare smile, watching his men enjoy the reward they'd earned. For a moment, they weren't just cowboys. They were conquerors of the frontier. Jake sat by the bar, listening to the music and voices. Nearby, two strangers argued over a card hand, voices sharp and rising. A shot cracked suddenly, freezing the room. One man fell, clutching his arm, and the other stood pale with shock. The sheriff, Bat Masterson himself, strode in, calm and certain, his hand resting on his revolver. Order was swift, and silence fell. Such scenes were common in Dodge. It was a place balanced between civilization and wilderness, where men brought their tempers, hopes, and sins. The cowboys, despite their rough manners, were often the most disciplined men there. They had lived too close to death to take it lightly. Jake sipped his drink and said nothing. He had seen worse on the trail. Later, he stepped outside into the cool night. The street shimmered under the glow of lanterns. Music drifted from every doorway, blending with the laughter of women and the distant whinny of horses. The prairie stretched beyond the town's edge, silent and endless. For all its noise, Dodge was still surrounded by the same wild emptiness. Jake walked toward the livery to check on Scout. The horse nickered softly. Recognizing him, he brushed its mane, whispering words that only the two of them understood. Out there, on the trail, Scout had been his closest friend, steady, loyal, and alive in ways men rarely were. The connection between a cowboy and his horse was something sacred. That night, Jake found a room above the saloon. The bed was small and hard, but it felt like luxury after weeks on the ground. Through the window, he watched the lights flicker across Dodge City. Somewhere below, a fiddle played a slow tune, one of those songs that carried both joy and sorrow. He fell asleep before it ended. Morning came bright and loud. The streets buzzed with traders, gamblers, and new herds arriving from the south. The cowboys, bleary-eyed and hungover, gathered for breakfast, eggs, biscuits, and coffee that tasted almost civilized. Hank announced that the cattle had sold well. Each man would get his share by evening. Cheers followed. With money in their pockets, the men scattered. Billy returned to the poker table. Gus went in search of a new frying pan and a stronger drink. Jake wandered instead toward the general store, curious about the goods of civilization. Rifles, boots, tobacco, books. The clerk smiled politely but watched him closely. Cowboys were good for business, but trouble followed them. Outside, a poster caught Jake's eye. Land for sale, homesteads available. 160 acres free to settlers. The Homestead Act had changed everything. The open range was shrinking, replaced by fences and towns. The age of the cowboy, though no one said it aloud, was slowly dying. The trail drives would soon be memories. That thought lingered as the day wore on. By afternoon, Jake joined his crew for one last round at the saloon. They laughed, sang, and toasted to the next drive, though each man knew it might be the last. The West was changing fast, and the men who had built it were being pushed aside by progress and steel rails. When night fell again, Jake walked to the edge of town. The prairie wind brushed against him, whispering in the tall grass. The lights of Dodge flickered behind him, but ahead lay only stars and silence. He felt the pull of both worlds, the freedom of the trail and the comfort of the town, and knew he belonged entirely to neither. Tomorrow, he would ride out again. Maybe not north this time, maybe not even for cattle, but somewhere out there, beyond fences and telegraph lines, the Old West still breathed, wild, untamed, and waiting. And for as long as it lived, so would men like Jake Malone. When the money ran low and the noise of Dodge City grew dull, Most cowboys drifted back to where they belonged, the open land. Jake was no different. A few nights of whiskey and laughter couldn't fill the quiet that lived inside him. The prairie called again, and by dawn, he was gone, riding west toward the frontier line. The horizon stretched endlessly, dotted with dry creek beds and clusters of cottonwood trees. Civilization faded behind him until all that remained was wind, dust, and sky. For men like Jake, the frontier wasn't just a place. It was a way of life. Every sunrise meant freedom, but also risk. Out here, a man survived by his skill, his gun, and his horse. Jake wasn't alone for long. He soon joined a small ranching outfit near the Arkansas River, a patch of land run by a wiry old rancher named McBride. The work was steady but harsh, mending fences, branding calves, and chasing off rustlers who prowled like wolves at night. The pay was meager, but the land itself felt honest. Life on the frontier ranches demanded toughness. Water was scarce, food plain, and the nearest town often 2 days away. The men rose before dawn, eating beans or biscuits by firelight, and worked until the sun slipped behind the hills. By evening, their hands were cracked, their backs stiff, but there was pride in the labor. McBride's ranch wasn't large. A few hundred head of cattle, a corral, a barn, and a sod house that stood like a scar on the land. Yet in those walls, there was warmth. McBride's wife, Clara, kept the place running, sewing clothes, tending the garden, and somehow finding time to mother every young drifter who came through. Jake respected her more than most preachers. The nights were Jake's favorite. After the day's work, the men would sit on the porch, boots propped on the railing, watching the stars come alive. Someone would play a harmonica, and the world would shrink to that small circle of light and laughter. There was no law out there except decency and grit, and that was enough. But danger was never far. Rustlers haunted the borderlands, stealing cattle and sometimes lives. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, a distant gunshot cracked through the air. The men froze. McBride squinted toward the hills, then barked orders. "Saddle up, boys." In the west, justice rode fast and personal. Jake mounted Scout, heart pounding, and joined the small posse. They followed the trail through dry grass and over shallow gullies, the fading light turning the land to shadow. The tracks led to a narrow canyon where smoke curled from a dying campfire. 3 rustlers, unaware they'd been found, sat counting stolen hides. McBride raised his rifle, signaling the men to spread out. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the soft snort of horses. When the first shot rang, chaos followed, bullets sparking off rocks, men shouting, horses rearing. Jake fired once, saw a man drop, then ducked behind a boulder. The fight was quick and brutal. When the smoke cleared, 2 rustlers lay dead and 1 wounded. McBride dismounted, his face carved with steel and sorrow. "Bury him," he said simply. There were no jails out here, no judges. Justice came with the gun and the earth that swallowed the fallen. Jake helped dig the graves in silence, his hands trembling from adrenaline and regret. They rode back under a cold moon, the prairie silver and still. Jake couldn't shake the thought that every man out there lived one heartbeat from the same fate, outlaw or not. On the frontier, the line between right and wrong was drawn in dust, and the wind erased it each morning. Days turned into weeks. The work went on, relentless as time itself. Jake learned to patch fences with wire, to read clouds for rain, to move quietly through herds without spooking them. His body grew harder, his thoughts simpler. Out there, a man didn't dwell on dreams. He lived from sunrise to sunrise, grateful for breath and bread. Sometimes travelers stopped by the ranch. Traders, soldiers, or wandering settlers heading west. They brought news from the outside world. New railroads, new towns, the promise of statehood. Each word was another reminder that the Old West was shrinking. McBride would spit tobacco and mutter, "Soon there'll be fences from here to Kansas City." Jake didn't know whether to hope or mourn. Civilization meant safety, law, and comfort, things every man claimed to want. But it also meant the death of what he loved most, the silence, the space, the sense of being unbound. The frontier made men raw and real, stripped of pretense. Fences would tame the land, and perhaps break it. One night, a cold wind swept across the plains. Jake lay awake in the bunkhouse, listening to it moan through the cracks. He thought of all the men who'd come before, the trappers, scouts, and riders who carved their lives into this land. Their stories were fading, just like the stars at dawn. Maybe someday, his would too. By morning, frost coated the grass like silver dust. The herd moved slow in the chill, their breath rising in clouds. Jake saddled Scout and rode out alone to check the northern pasture. The world around him felt vast, eternal. Yet he knew it was changing, not in storms or battles, but in the quiet march of progress. He stopped at the ridge and looked north. In the far distance, he could see a faint line, rails glinting in the sun. A train whistle echoed faintly, cutting through the morning wind. It was the sound of the future, and it carried both promise and farewell. Jake tipped his hat to the horizon. The train whistle grew louder with each passing month. What once sounded distant and ghostly now echoed daily across the prairie, a steel song of change. To many, it was progress. Proof that civilization had finally tamed the wilderness. But to men like Jake Malone, it was the sound of an ending. The railroads had carved their way westward, linking the old world to the new. Where once only cattle trails crossed the plains, now gleaming rails stretched to the horizon. The great drives that had fed the east were becoming obsolete. With every mile of track laid, the cowboy's freedom shrank a little more. Jake rode along the ridgeline one morning, watching the smoke rise from a train far below. It moved like a black serpent across the land, its whistle slicing through the still air. He felt awe, but also unease. The same land he'd ridden freely now belonged to companies and maps. Measured, fenced, and sold. McBride had cursed the rails from the start. "Ain't no good comes from men who ride without horses," he'd say, spitting tobacco into the dirt. "They don't smell the rain or know the sky. They're just machines riding machines." Jake couldn't argue. He'd seen how towns sprang up overnight. Noisy, greedy, hollow things that swallowed the open land. One afternoon, riders from the railroad company arrived at the ranch. They carried papers and offers, smiling like men who'd never had to fight for a meal. They spoke of progress, of buying land for depots and track. McBride stood silent, then turned them away with words sharp as his spurs. "The land's not for sale," he said. But even he knew the fight was lost. A month later, surveyors returned, marking the earth with wooden stakes. Jake helped tear them down twice, but they always came back. The law was on the railroad side, backed by money and Washington's signatures. Soon, steam engines would roll where the cattle once grazed. The old ways couldn't hold against iron and fire. For Jake, the change came slow but certain. The ranch lost pasture as fences rose around them. Herds dwindled, and prices dropped. Cattle could be shipped directly by rail from Texas now. No need for the long drives north. Cowboys began to drift away, trading their saddles for steady pay in towns or mines. The era was dying in silence. One evening, as Jake fixed a broken fence, Billy rode up, older now, his face lined from years of sun. "Heard they're laying track 5 miles south," he said, pulling off his hat. "McBride's selling part of his range." Jake nodded, though the words cut deep. Even the stubborn ones had to bend eventually. That night, Jake sat by the fire outside the bunkhouse, listening to the faint rumble of a distant train. The stars looked smaller somehow, the horizon less endless. He thought of the first trail drive he'd ridden, the roar of hooves, the smell of dust and rain. It felt like another lifetime, one the world had already forgotten. The next morning, he rode out early, following the sound of hammers on steel. A work crew was laying track across the valley. Dozens of men, black with soot and sweat, pounding spikes into ties. The air stank of coal and oil. Steam hissed from the locomotive that waited nearby, ready to crawl forward another 100 yards. Jake stopped at the edge of the site, watching silently. The foreman waved, shouting something he couldn't hear. Around him, the prairie that once stretched free was now scarred by trenches and rails. Progress, they called it, though it looked more like conquest. He turned Scout around and rode back without a word. By autumn, the first train passed near McBride's ranch. The ground shook, and the cattle scattered in fear. Clara covered her ears as the iron beast roared past, its whistle echoing off the hills. Jake stood at the fence, eyes narrowed, watching the black smoke fade into the distance. It was beautiful, in its own terrible way. The world was moving forward, and he was standing still. Towns grew where there had been silence. Telegraph wires sliced across the sky like spiderwebs. The frontier that had once seemed eternal was closing fast. The cowboys, scouts, and drifters, the men who had carried the West on their backs, were becoming relics of memory. Winter came early that year. The snow fell thick and heavy, blanketing the plains. Work slowed, and the ranch felt emptier than ever. McBride spent his days by the fire, nursing a cough that wouldn't quit. Jake took on most of the chores, feeding the herd, cutting wood, keeping the place alive. The sound of the train still drifted on the wind. One night, Clara handed Jake a letter. It was from a cattle buyer in Kansas, offering work managing a new shipping yard by the rails. "They need men who know the trade," she said softly. Jake turned the envelope in his hands, unsure. The idea of working for the very thing that had killed his way of life twisted his stomach. But the West was unforgiving to those who stood still. He accepted. By spring, he packed his saddle and said goodbye to the McBrides. Clara hugged him like a son. "The world's changing, Jake," she said. "Best you ride with it, not against it." He nodded, though his heart stayed somewhere back in the open plains. As he rode north along the new tracks, he felt the pull of two worlds, the wild one fading behind him, and the iron one ahead. The whistle of a passing train cut through the air, and for the first time, he didn't flinch. Maybe the cowboy's time was ending, but its spirit, the grit, the freedom, the courage, would live on in men like him. The Kansas rail yard was a different kind of frontier, one made of iron, noise, and money. Jake arrived just as dawn broke over a forest of smokestacks. The air smelled of coal and sweat instead of sage and rain. Men shouted, engines hissed, and cattle bellowed from wooden pens that stretched for acres. It was the West reshaped, tamed, and fenced in by industry. Jake's job was to manage incoming herds from the southern ranges. The work was familiar, yet hollow. He missed the long rides under the open sky, the thunder of hooves rolling like distant storms. Here, the herds came off trains, penned, weighed, and sold by numbers. It was efficient, profitable, and soulless. Still, Jake did what he'd always done, worked hard and kept his word. The yard bosses liked him. He was steady, quiet, never drunk, and never late. But when night fell and the engine slept, he'd sit on the rail platform, staring toward the west. Somewhere out there were the grasslands he'd once called home, now dotted with towns, farms, and fences that ran straight to the horizon. By 1885, the railroad had conquered nearly every stretch of the frontier. The cattle trails of his youth, the Chisholm, the Goodnight Loving, the Shawnee, were fading into dust. The last big drives were history now, spoken of with nostalgia in saloons. Cowboys became hired hands, ranch guards, or drifted into mining camps. The free riders of the plains were no more. Jake heard stories from the trail hands who passed through. They said Texas was fenced solid. Barbed wire strung across land that had once been open to all. The range wars between ranchers and settlers left burned fields and bodies buried in shallow graves. Progress, it seemed, always demanded a price in blood. One evening, Jake walked into town after work. Kansas City was booming. Saloons, theaters, electric lamps, even paved streets. The faces were new, the accents strange. He passed a newsstand and saw a headline, "The Closing of the Frontier." It made him pause. Could something as vast as the West really end? He bought the paper, though he couldn't bring himself to read it. At the bar, he met a young cowboy just off a short drive. The boy's hat was too clean, his boots too new. "Heard you work the old trails," the boy said, eyes bright. "What was it like?" Jake smiled faintly. "Long," he said. "Hot, dust in your teeth and wind in your soul. Nothing else like it." The boy grinned, but Jake saw in him a hunger for a world already gone. That night, Jake dreamed of the prairie again, the endless roll of grass, the call of coyotes, the campfire glow under the stars. He woke before dawn, heart heavy. The world outside his window was dim and gray, filled with the clatter of trains and the hum of factories. The west of his memory lived only in sleep now. In spring, he took leave from the yard and rode west on an old bay horse he bought cheap. The country had changed beyond recognition. Towns had sprung up every 20 miles. Telegraph poles lined the roads like sentinels. The rivers were bridged, the passes mapped, the wild tamed. Yet in the far corners, beyond the reach of steel, Fragments of the old world remained. He rode for days until he reached the high plains again. There, for the first time in years, he saw open land without fences. Buffalo grass rippled in the wind, and a hawk circled overhead. Jake dismounted, let his horse graze, and sat in the silence. For a few hours, it was as if time had turned back. That evening, he camped by a creek and built a small fire. The flames danced in the dark, just as they had when he'd been a trailhand. He could almost hear the laughter of his old crew, the voice of McBride calling the herd. The memories were ghosts now, faint, fading, but they still warmed him. At dawn, Jake found the ruins of an old line camp. The roof had caved in, and tumbleweeds filled the corral. He ran his hand along a half-buried post and felt a wave of melancholy. This had been the heart of a life, his life, now swallowed by dust. A crow cried overhead, as if echoing his thought, "Nothing lasts forever." Later that day, he met a farmer and his wife driving a wagon east. They offered him coffee and told him they'd come from Missouri to start anew. "Good land out here," the man said proudly. "Fertile, open. We'll build a house by winter." Jake nodded. The man's dream was built on the bones of his own, but he couldn't begrudge them. Everyone deserved a chance at a life. As he rode on, Jake realized the West hadn't died. It had simply changed hands. The freedom he'd known had become stability for others. The wild had become home. Civilization had taken root where dust once ruled. The cowboy's world, rough, fleeting, untamed, had served its purpose. It had bridged the gap between wilderness and nation. That night, Jake returned to the city with a strange peace. He'd seen what remained of the old ways and understood their place in history. The rails that once felt like chains now seemed like veins, carrying life and connection across the land. The West wasn't dying. It was evolving, growing, breathing in new rhythms. He kept working at the yard for a few more years, training younger men and teaching them the trade. But whenever the wind blew in from the plains, carrying that familiar scent of grass and dust, Jake would pause and look west. Somewhere beyond the smoke and rail lines, the spirit of the frontier still whispered, wild, defiant, eternal. By the late 1880s, the Wild West was turning into stories told by lamplight. Outlaws, gunfights, and trail rides had become legend, polished tales for city papers and dime novels. Jake Malone, who had lived the truth of it, found himself reading fictions about the world he once knew. They made heroes out of thieves and monsters out of working men. He'd pass the newsstand every morning and see faces like Wild Bill, Billy the Kid, or Jesse James, staring back from lurid covers. The artist painted them as fearless rebels, symbols of freedom in a world growing tame. Jake knew better. He'd seen men like them die in the mud, scared and young. But the public wanted myths, not memories. One evening, Jake stopped in a saloon near the rail yard. Inside, a traveling storyteller was spinning tales of frontier justice. Sheriffs facing outlaws at dawn, duels fought for honor. The crowd cheered, half-drunk and wide-eyed. Jake sat quietly at the back, his hat low. When the man finished, he clapped along with everyone else, though his heart felt heavy. Later, the storyteller joined him for a drink. "You from out west, mister?" he asked. Jake nodded. "Rode trail for near 20 years. The man's eyes lit up. "Then you've lived what I tell." Jake smiled faintly. "Maybe, but it wasn't all gun smoke and glory." The man chuckled. "No one pays for the truth, friend. They pay for the dream." That line stayed with Jake long after. The dream of the West, of freedom, danger, and boundless horizons, had replaced the real thing. The land was settled, the law was written, and the wilderness that once tested men's souls was vanishing under fences and deeds. What survived was the legend, larger than life and cleaner than truth. The new generation of cowboys were different. They worked on fenced ranches, their days ruled by schedules and foremen. Many had never driven a herd across open range, never slept under stars without a roof. But they wore the same hats, sang the same songs, and believed they were carrying on the spirit. Maybe, Jake thought, they were right in their own way. He spent his evenings at the stockyard office, writing in a small leather-bound journal. It wasn't for fame, just memory. He wrote about McBride, about Billy and the trail drives, about nights when the coyotes sang louder than the wind. He wanted to leave behind a record for those who'd never know what it truly meant to ride free. Sometimes, local reporters came by, looking for quotes from old cowhands. Jake would tell them small truths about the dust, the danger, the endless miles. But they only printed the lines that fit their fantasy. The last of the trail riders, they'd call him, though he'd never sought that title. It was strange, becoming a relic in your own lifetime. In 1890, the U.S. Census officially declared the frontier closed. The news spread across the country like a funeral bell. Jake read the announcement in the morning paper and stared at it for a long time. Closed, it said, as if the land could be sealed like a door. The words didn't make sense. The West wasn't gone. It was just different. That same year, Buffalo Bill Cody brought his Wild West show to Kansas City. Jake went, curious. He sat in the stands as riders galloped in, shooting blanks into the air, chasing painted bison, reenacting battles he remembered too well. The crowd roared in wonder. For them, it was spectacle. For Jake, it was memory turned into theater. When the show ended, he lingered near the corral, watching the performers unsaddle their horses. One of them, a young man in a bright red shirt, nodded to him. "You ride?" he asked. Jake smiled. "Used to." The boy grinned. "Once a cowboy, always a cowboy." Jake tipped his hat and walked away, unsure if that was true anymore. That night, back in his room, he wrote again. "The West lives in stories now," he began. "And maybe that's where it belongs. We were never meant to last forever, only to blaze a trail for those who'd come after." The words brought him peace. He wasn't bitter anymore. The world had changed, and so had he. Still, every once in a while, he'd ride out past the edge of town, where the land stretched quiet and open. The horizon looked the same, endless, golden, untouched by progress. There, he could almost believe the old days had never ended. He'd take off his hat, breathe deep, and feel the ghost of the frontier stir in the wind. Law had replaced chaos, and legend had replaced life. But in those rare, still moments, Jake knew the truth. The spirit of the West was not gone. It lived in the courage to start anew, in the stubborn will to face the unknown. It lived in men who kept riding, even when the trail ended. The winter of 1892 came harsh and early. Ice glazed the rail yards, and the wind cut through every crack like a knife. Jake Malone, now gray around the temples, worked slower but still steady. Most of the young men at the yard called him Old Jake, a title he carried with quiet pride. He had outlasted the trail, the war, and the frontier itself. One evening, the foreman handed him a letter. It bore the seal of a ranch in Wyoming, the McBride Ranch, though the handwriting was new. Clara had passed away, the letter said. The ranch had been sold, the land divided among settlers. Jake sat long after reading it, staring at the fire. Another piece of the old world had slipped away. The next morning, he packed his saddle and left. No one at the yard stopped him. They all knew this was something he had to do. The journey north took a week by train, but Jake rode the last miles on horseback, cutting across the plains as he once had in his youth. Each hoofbeat sounded like a heartbeat against the frozen ground. When he reached the McBride place, it was almost unrecognizable. Fences and plowed fields stretched where open pasture had been. The house stood weathered and empty, its shutters flapping in the wind. He dismounted slowly and walked the grounds. Every step stirred a memory. Billy laughing by the corral, McBride barking orders, Clara humming in the kitchen. Ghosts everywhere. He spent the night in the old bunkhouse. The roof leaked, and the fire smoked, but it felt right. He sat by the dying flames, reading from his journal. The ink had faded, but the words carried him back to the trails. The storms, the dust, the long nights of endless stars. He realized then that his story, like the West's, was coming to an end. At dawn, Jake saddled his horse, a weathered bay he'd named Scout 2, and rode toward the hills. The snow had melted slightly, leaving patches of yellow grass beneath. The sky was pale and vast, that same endless blue he'd known all his life. He rode slowly, savoring each breath of cold air, each creak of leather. This was not a journey of distance, but of farewell. By midday, he reached a high ridge overlooking the valley. The land below shimmered gold and brown, stitched with rivers and new roads. Smoke rose from farmhouses in the distance. Civilization had taken root, yet the wind still sang the old song, the whisper of freedom that once drew men west. Jake closed his eyes and listened. He thought of the men he'd ridden with, McBride, Billy, the nameless hands lost on the trail. They had carved their mark in dust and sweat, then vanished like shadows at sunset. None would make the history books, but without them, there'd be no railroads, no towns, no nation stretching from sea to shining sea. The cowboy's legacy was silent, but eternal. That afternoon, he made camp by a small creek. He boiled coffee, sliced a piece of dried beef, and sat beside the fire. The flames crackled softly, and for a moment, the years fell away. He could almost see the herd again, endless horns moving like a living river, dust rising in the sun. The memory brought a small, peaceful smile to his face. When night came, the stars returned, clear and bright as ever. Jake lay on his bedroll, staring up at them. They were the same stars he'd followed across the plains decades ago, unchanged by all the world's progress. "We did all right," he murmured to the sky. "We kept it alive as long as we could." The wind carried his words away like prayer smoke. By morning, the fire had gone out, and frost sparkled on the grass. A ranch hand from the new settlement found him later that day, sitting upright against a rock, hat in hand, eyes closed as if still watching the horizon. The horse grazed nearby, calm and waiting. Jake Malone had ridden his last trail, quiet, dignified, free. The news spread quietly through the town and rail yard. Few knew him well, but those who had worked beside him lowered their hats in respect. The papers ran a short notice: former trail rider found dead near the old McBride Ranch. One of the last true cowboys. It was a small headline, but to those who understood, it meant everything. A week later, the foreman found Jake's journal among his belongings. He read a few lines before closing it reverently. He wasn't chasing legend, the foreman said. He was living truth. The journal was later passed to a small museum, where it rested under glass, a quiet testament to a man and an age that refused to fade completely. A week later, the foreman found Jake's journal among his belongings. He read a few lines before closing it reverently. He wasn't chasing legend, the foreman said. He was living truth. The journal was later passed to a small museum, where it rested under glass, a quiet testament to a man and an age that refused to fade completely. And out there, beyond the farms and the rails, the prairie still stretched wide. The wind still moved the grass like waves, and the sky still burned at sunset. Somewhere in that vast silence, the spirit of Jake Malone, and of every rider who ever followed the trail, lived on. Not in monuments or books, but in the eternal rhythm of the land itself. Years after the last trail rides and railroads tamed the plains, the spirit of the cowboy lived on, not in open pastures, but in stories, art, and the hearts of those who remembered. Newspapers, novels, and later films celebrated a world most had never seen. A myth built from dust, sweat, and courage. Jake Malone's name appeared only rarely, whispered among old men who had ridden with him or heard his stories from McBride's ranch. Yet his life, the truth of the trail, the storms, the cattle drives, became part of a greater legacy. The frontier was no longer land to conquer but memory to preserve. By the 1920s, Hollywood began shaping the West into legend. Silver screens glimmered with cowboys riding across endless plains, duels at high noon, and dramatic stagecoaches racing against time. The real men were long gone, but their courage and skill inspired a new generation of storytellers and dreamers. Jake's descendants, distant cousins and nieces, read the journals he had left behind. In his words, they found not just adventure, but lessons of endurance, honesty, and humility. The world had changed, yet these pages captured a truth that no train, fence, or town could erase. Rodeos, too, kept the traditions alive. Young riders tumbled from horses in dusty arenas, yet their skills echoed those of men like Jake. Branding contests, cattle wrangling exhibitions, and storytelling contests celebrated the craft and courage of the original cowhands. In these rituals, the West remained alive, even as the landscape had shifted forever. Museums preserved saddles, spurs, and old leather journals. Visitors read about the perilous drives, the storms, and the long nights under stars. Jake's life became an exemplar, not a legend of reckless heroics, but a record of endurance, skill, and humanity. People came to learn what it meant to be truly free, to ride with responsibility and heart. Schoolchildren studied maps of the old trails, tracing the Chisholm, the goodnight loving, and countless other routes. Teachers recited stories of cowboys defending herds, battling the elements, and forming communities in the wilderness. For these children, the West was no longer just history. It was a lesson in courage, perseverance, and respect for nature. Even literature carried forward the memory. Authors like Zane Grey and Owen Wister dramatized the West, mixing truth with legend. While Hollywood polished it further, the roots were real. Men like Jake, who had lived the work, faced danger daily, and forged a life under vast skies. Fiction could exaggerate, but it could not erase reality. Festivals celebrated the open plains, cattle, and horseback riding. People from urban centers came to experience a taste of the frontier, to ride through valleys where buffalo once roamed, to listen to stories of the last true cowboys. The air smelled of smoke and grass, the wind carried echoes of hooves, a tangible connection to a fading era. Even in contemporary times, the cowboy symbolized freedom and resilience. Country music, Western art, and Americana all harkened back to the frontier's spirit. The image of men and women braving the wild became metaphors for ambition, courage, and self-reliance, qualities cherished in the American identity. Jake's journal, now preserved in a small museum, serves as a bridge between myth and reality. Visitors touch the leather cover, leaf through inked pages, and read the meticulous accounts of a life spent under sun, rain, and stars. They learned that the West was not always dramatic, but it was authentic, a place of hardship, beauty, and profound freedom. Through all these forms, film, literature, music, and museums, the West lives on. Not as it once was, but as it should be remembered, wild yet human, dangerous yet noble. Jake Malone's story, along with countless others, remains etched in memory, proof that the frontier shaped men, culture, and the soul of a nation. Even today, when a cowboy rides across a prairie or a rodeo champion competes, the legacy whispers, freedom demands skill, respect, and courage. The land may have changed, fences may divide it, and trains may roar across it, but the spirit endures. Every dust storm, every sunset, every thunderclap echoes with the memory of the men who first rode there. In the quiet of a museum at dusk, a child reads of Jake Malone's last ride. She imagines the wind on her face, the endless horizon, the pulse of hooves over grass. Though she may never see it for herself, she understands. The West is not gone. It lives in those who honor its truth. The legend and reality have merged, eternal and untouchable. Jake Malone's life had stretched across the most transformative decades of the American West. He had ridden trails, faced storms, wrestled cattle, and navigated the encroachment of railroads and towns. Now, older and quieter, he reflected on the world he had helped shape. The West had changed, but his memories remained vivid, unaltered by time. Sitting by a hearth in a small cabin he rented near the rail yard, Jake pored over his journals. Each page was a testament to resilience, courage, and patience. The inked words captured trails, storms, and nights beneath endless stars. Here was the reality behind the legends, unvarnished but filled with the poetry of living close to nature and danger. He remembered the first trail drives, the scent of dust, the thundering hooves, the quiet camaraderie of men who relied on one another. McBride, Billy, Gus, Clara, all had left their marks on him, some in life, some in memory. These faces, etched in memory, were as real as the land itself, forming the foundation of his identity. The railroads had arrived, transforming the open plains into tracks and fences. Towns rose where herds once roamed free, and civilization brought safety but also an end to the way of life he loved. Jake watched, sometimes with sadness, sometimes with acceptance. Progress was inevitable, yet he carried the essence of the frontier wherever he went. Even as his world shrank to rail yards, town streets, and cabins, Jake found solace in the stars. Every night, he stepped outside, letting the wind carry memories across the plains. The sky was unchanged, the same vast canvas he had ridden under for decades. It reminded him that some things endured beyond human hands. Jake's reflection often turned to the young men who entered his life briefly. Trail hands, ranch boys, or visitors from towns. He taught them not only about handling cattle and horses, but about respect for the land and understanding the rhythm of life in the wild. His lessons became echoes of a world no longer physically present but alive in wisdom. He understood that the West would now live in story, legend, and imagination. His journals, preserved in a small museum, would inform generations of what the frontier truly required: courage, skill, and integrity. Legends might simplify or dramatize events, but the essence of enduring hardships, riding with freedom, and facing the unknown remained intact. As he neared the end of his days, Jake often rode alone on Scout 2, tracing old trails now faint under grass and new roads. The sun set in brilliant reds and golds, casting long shadows across land that had once been limitless. He felt the history in every stone, every ridge, every whispering wind. The past and present coexisted, fragile yet eternal. One winter morning, Jake awoke to snow covering the plains. He saddled Scout 2 for a final ride, heading toward a ridge overlooking the valley. The wind whispered across the frozen grass, carrying echoes of the old trails. He paused at the crest, taking in the panorama: rivers, fences, towns, and the endless horizon beyond. He breathed deeply, letting the memory of the open West fill him. At the top, Jake dismounted, laying a hand on Scout I's neck. "We did all right," he murmured, voice lost to the wind. He looked west, toward open plains that no longer belonged to cowboys, yet still held the spirit of those who had ridden them. Here, in this quiet, he felt the full weight of his life's journey. Hardships endured, victories earned, and freedom lived. He let the reins drop and stood silently, watching the land. The sun dipped lower, painting the valley in warm light. Every detail, the swaying grasses, the distant hills, the whisper of wind, was a memory and a lesson. He understood that while the era of cowboys had ended, its values, resilience, courage, and respect would remain timeless. Returning to the cabin, Jake penned one final entry in his journal. "The West taught me how to live and die with honor, to respect the land, the animals, and men. The trails are gone, but their spirit rides on in every sunrise, every storm, every star-filled night. The frontier lives as long as we remember it." He closed the book with quiet reverence. In his final years, Jake spent days tending a small garden, caring for Scout 2, and sharing stories with anyone willing to listen. His presence became a living bridge between the frontier past and the modernizing world. People came seeking adventure, only to learn that the real adventure was endurance, responsibility, and heart. When Jake Malone passed, he did so peacefully, surrounded by memories of open plains, thundering herds, and long trails. His horse grazed nearby as friends and former companions honored him. Though the physical West had changed, the spirit he embodied, the courage, freedom, and resilience of the cowboy, endured. In museums, in stories, in films and rodeos, Jake's life continues to echo. He became part of the broader narrative, the legacy of a generation who bridged wilderness and civilization. The West he knew and loved may have faded, but through memory, legend, and reflection, it remains eternal. And so, the story ends where it began, under endless skies, across plains vast and open, with the wind carrying the whispers of cowboys, trails, and freedom. Jake Malone's journey, like the frontier itself, becomes timeless, a testament to living boldly, honestly, and fully in the untamed beauty of the West. The sun dipped low over the plains, painting the horizon in shades of gold and crimson. Jake Malone sat quietly on the ridge, Scout 2 grazing nearby, and watched the land he had known so intimately. The world had changed. Fences now divided the fields, railroads cut straight lines through valleys, and towns thrived where dust and wind once ruled. Yet the heart of the West remained alive in memory. Jake reflected on the decades he had spent chasing herds, facing storms, and riding under endless skies. Every ride, every struggle, and every quiet night by the fire had left its mark on him. He realized that the West was more than a place. It was a way of life, a test of courage and endurance. The lessons of freedom, honor, and respect for the land would outlast fences, trains, and towns. As the wind whispered through the grass, Jake felt a profound peace. The old trails might be gone, and the frontier closed, but the spirit of those who had ridden them endured. In every rodeo, every tale told by lamplight, every line in a history book, the essence of the cowboy lived on. He smiled, knowing that he had been part of something greater than himself, a legacy of courage, resilience, and freedom. The stars began to emerge, bright and eternal, and Jake tipped his hat to the horizon. He understood now that endings were simply beginnings in another form. The West had shaped him, and he had carried its spirit into a world that was no longer wild. And as night fell, the wind carried the echo of hooves across the plains, a reminder that the trail never truly ends. It lives on in memory, in story, and in the hearts of those who dare to ride. Jake rose, mounted Scout 2, and rode slowly down the ridge. The last light of the day kissed the prairie, and for one final moment, the open west stretched limitless before him.